For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates.
In the world of defense and security, the biggest news currently is the withdrawal of the American and the NATO forces from Afghanistan, retreating after what looks like a major defeat, despite 20 years of presence and fight with the Taliban in Afghanistan. But there was a similar situation that the Americans faced almost 45 years ago, in 1975, in another part of Asia, in Vietnam. That's the story I'm going to recount in this week's Simply Nitin. I'm Nitin Gokhale. So while the world debates why the Americans are leaving in a hurry from Afghanistan, leaving the country to fend for itself against the rampaging Taliban, supported by the rogue spy agency of Pakistan, the Inter-Services Intelligence or ISI. There is a deja vu amongst long-time defense watchers. If you look back about 4 decades ago or 5 decades ago, the Americans had to beat similar hasty retreat from Southeast Asia, more particularly Vietnam. On 30th April 1975, as the images and video footage of American helicopters on the roof of the American embassy in Saigon were taking off, loaded with people, the world saw for the first time the humiliating retreat the Americans had to make from Vietnam after nearly 20 years of war. There is a lot of uncanny similarity between what happened in Vietnam between 1955 and 1975 and what is happening in Afghanistan between year 2001 and August 2021 or July 2021 as we speak. First, the Americans, despite their intervention and their intention to establish democracy in a poor country like Vietnam or Afghanistan and trying to keep the communists at bay, in this case the Taliban, the Islamic fighters at bay in Afghanistan, the Americans, despite their huge firepower, deep pockets and of course better technology, could not defeat smaller adversaries either in Vietnam or in Afghanistan. If you look back at the Vietnam War, in fact, the Vietnam War was a 10-year war between 1965 and 1975 where there was direct American involvement. But it was part of a larger war that broke out in what was then known as Indochina. It started in 1955 when the French tried to occupy or control what was then Indochina, which consisted of Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, that region which is in Southeast Asia. When that didn't work out, the French made a retreat and the Americans under President John F. Kennedy started increasing their involvement in Vietnam. If you look at the statistics of that war between 1965, which actually is the period in which the American involvement was the maximum between 1965 and 1975, it's staggering. While in Afghanistan, nearly 3,000 American servicemen and women have died because of the Taliban insurgency and the fight with the Taliban since 2001. By all accounts, the Vietnam War was one of the most brutal conflicts in the 20th century. The figures, as I said, are staggering. Apart from the 58,000 American servicemen who died in Vietnam, 250,000 South Vietnamese soldiers perished in the conflict. 10 lakh North Vietnamese soldiers were killed. 20 lakh civilians died in various circumstances. And it is therefore known as the decade of agony in Vietnam. And Vietnam's agony didn't end there. Having beaten one superpower, that is the French, in the 1950s, then making sure that the Americans retreated in the 1970s, the Vietnamese had to beat back the Chinese in 1979. That tiny small nation whose map is actually elongated kind of a rope which is twisted if you see from north to south, has such resilience and such fighting spirit amongst the people that three superpowers or three big nations had to make a retreat in defeat from Vietnam. So, which were the sides that were fighting the Vietnam War? As I mentioned, the North Vietnamese were being backed by a communist coalition of China and the erstwhile USSR or the Soviet Union. The South Vietnamese were being supported and supplied by arms and training by the Americans, supported again by Australia, Philippines, and other allied countries, even South Korea. Now, the fight was between the communist ideology and the capitalist or the free democracy ideology that was being propagated by the Americans. The Americans got involved, but it was a war that they were never going to win because the North Vietnamese were adept guerrilla fighters. They harassed Americans, they won victories over them despite hardships, despite being short supplied or being short on weapons and technology, because they knew the countryside inside out. The Americans were new to the countryside, they did not know how to fight a counterinsurgency war or a counterinsurgency conflict. And of course, from 67, 68, 69 onwards, the Americans lost the stomach for a fight because back home, the people started protesting against the Vietnam War and its brutalities. As I mentioned, civilians in large numbers were victims of this fight between the two sides. There was napalm bombing. There were, these famous photographs of a young child running away when she's bombed. I mean, she's caught in that bombing of chemical weapons, where she's singed by that chemical weapons and she's had to disrobe herself. 5-year-old kid, a 6-year-old kid fleeing the conflict area. That's one of the most defining photographs of Vietnam. There are, of course, other protest photographs in America itself. Civil rights protests started in the US. There was a draft, that is the compulsory recruitment of people was being made by the Americans, by the American government, which was protested by many athletes, many civilians. The most prominent among them was Muhammad Ali, the famous boxer, who was earlier, his original name was Cassius Clay. He, what he said is that I'm not going to get drafted into compulsory military service. And he had to be, he was punished by law, because that was a law. Many people dodged the draft, as they call it in America, but there was also a parallel protest movement, and the Americans, as I said, lost the will to fight or fund the Vietnam War. At one time, there were nearly, from what one account says, there were nearly 500,000, that is nearly 5 lakh American troops on the Vietnamese soil around 1969-70, fighting a band of guerrillas. Of course, there was the legendary guerrilla fighters, Ho Chi Minh, General Van Giap, and of course, the Chinese were supplying them with weapons, the USSR was supplying them with weapons. And the Vietnam War is remembered in America because of the tension that it created in the society. There were many, many Americans, many thousands, many millions of Americans who were opposing the Vietnam War. 3 presidents came and went, and they finally withdrew in 1975. As I said, that again another defining picture was that helicopter on the rooftop of the American embassy in Saigon, which is now known as Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam. So the North Vietnamese won the war. They united the country. So today Vietnam is one. There was also involvement of Cambodia and Laos in the war. It's a very long history. Actually, there's no time to explain all the complicated equations, permutation, combinations and all that. But suffice it to say that the American military had a humiliating defeat, and the after effects of that defeat continued for almost 10 to 15 years in the American military. The American military, the soldiers got very disillusioned because people were not supporting them. Many veterans of the Vietnam War went through traumatic personal time or personal kind of periods where they had post-traumatic disorders, stress disorders. They had mental disorders because they couldn't stand the kind of brutal fighting and the kind of suffering that the people were being made to go through in Vietnam, as well as their own colleagues were being slaughtered in many cases. If you look at some of these photographs, one will realize it was one of the most prolonged wars after World War II, and the American military really took a battering in that war. It was only in 1990-91 when the Gulf War I started, and the Americans won because of overwhelming technological superiority in the Gulf against Iraq by bombing Baghdad and bombing the ragtag large army of Saddam Hussein, that the American military redeemed itself. But except for that Gulf War and partly success in Iraq War in the 2000s, where Saddam Hussein was deposed, the Americans actually, if one looks back, from 1955 onwards, the Korean War in 1955 against the Chinese, the Vietnam War and the war in Afghanistan have only faced defeats. That's a major question that analysts and authors and people who write on war and conflict have posed, that why is it that such a overwhelmingly rich country which backs the military, which has the latest weaponry, the state-of-the-art platforms, huge navy, equally large air force, faces defeats in these countries. One war they lost in Vietnam to a small guerrilla army which was willing to fight and die for the country, and now they are facing the same defeat in Afghanistan. That is the question the Americans will increasingly ask. Of course, there is no comparison in terms of numbers between the Afghanistan war and the Vietnam war. As I mentioned, I have given the numbers earlier. But there is a lesson here that those who fight with their hearts and with their total involvement can actually overwhelm a larger adversary, like we have now seen in the case of the American troops, the American military, both in Vietnam as well as in Afghanistan. Now, you want to read, you want to see, there is a huge book there is a coffee table book on the Vietnam War, which actually flows out of a 7-part documentary done by a team of 4 people, which you will see on the screen, the coffee table book, which is actually as heavy as nearly 2 kgs. And then there are, of course, this is the book which I recommend to anybody interested in wars in the 20th century. The best of the selection of writing of war correspondence is in this book, the Mammoth Book of War Correspondence. It talks about the World War I, World War II, the Indochina War in 1955, and of course the Vietnam War. There are several descriptions. That time, remember, television was not as dominant as it is now. So people got their reports in the written form, in the written word. And therefore it's important to read these kind of books if you want to really know what happened in those wars. There are lessons to be learned. It seems the Americans haven't learned the lessons that they actually should have learned from the Vietnam War. But I just wanted to flag what happened, say, in 1975 when they retreated, and what is happening now in 2021, where Americans are again abandoning the Afghan people after giving them hope for nearly 20 years, after they ousted the Taliban and went after the Al-Qaeda in 2001 after the incident of 9/11 in New York. But that's the way the cookie crumbles as far as large armies, big nations, rich nations are concerned, because they are the ones who somehow are not able to understand what makes the guerrillas tick. And therefore there's a lesson there for anybody who wants to fight on a foreign soil. Any army, any military wants to fight on the foreign soil. That's all I have this time. But do keep watching StratNews Global and of course Simply Nitin. I'll bring to you, as I usually do, some interesting facts, interesting anecdotes about war, conflict, technology, and some political incidents and accords as we normally do for the last 1.5 years that we have been doing. Until the next time, it's goodbye, but don't forget to send your feedback, give comments, and of course, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and of course, follow our social media handles. We are across the spectrum on Instagram, on Twitter, on Facebook, and you know our YouTube channel as well as the website. Until the next time, it's goodbye.